you know you're listening to Nirvana when you hear that open wind of a voice. You're listening to Nirvana when you hear the scream.
This was very powerful music, and it's kind of almost like a guide map to adolescence.
What happened with them is they got famous too fast. They went from just garage band to number one.
Kurt Cobain found fame brought more problems than it did joy to him. His life became very complicated when he became famous, and in some ways fame was actually a curse.
Rape me, my friend. Rape me. Rape me again.
Heroin kind of ruins lives and makes people completely hopeless, and I believe that he would still be here with us if he hadn't started getting into heroin.
We was here at the house and the phone rang stating that Kurt had committed suicide. And it really shocked my wife. Well, it did me too. I mean, I didn't think he was suicidal at all.
Nirvana began in 1987 in Aberdeen. Essentially, Krist Novoselic and Kurt Cobain got together.
Aberdeen is small, insular, blue-collar town. It feels far away.
Well, it's just kind of a everyday place. It's not too much going around. It's just pretty much the same thing every day.
It's a depressed timber town. There's no getting around that.
It's all right, I guess, but the economy kind of sucks a little bit. The work is kind of hard to find.
Aberdeen is one of these towns that's it's not who you are, it's what you are. I mean, people up on the hill, their kids could do no wrong.
Growing up then was, a lot of layoff news, a lot of mills shutting down, a lot of alcoholism, things like that. Depressing parts. And this is not the best weather area in the world as far as rain and gray clouds, which kind of adds to the bleakness of the area sometimes.
Yeah, I know Chris. I mean, he went to Aberdeen School, I went to Hogan, but we were the same year, and we were both in the music store all the time. I mean, for example, my wife sat next to Kurt in art class. It's a real small-knit town, and it's almost impossible. I mean, if you want to keep a secret from anyone, it's not going to happen in Aberdeen.
He started drawing, I suppose, about the time he could hold a pen in his hand or a pencil. This one here, he was 6 years old. And the way this come about was, he come over to the house one day and he had a picture of Mickey Mouse that he drew. And he says, Grandpa, he says, look what I drew. And I said, you didn't draw that. I said, you traced it. And he got about half mad. And he says, I did not. He says, you give me a piece of paper. And he said, I'll show you. He said, I won't draw you. He said, I'll draw Goofy. And so he drawed Goofy then. He done this one in 1980. He was a very nice little boy. Yeah, he was a really good kid. He really loved his dad and mother up until the time they divorced, and then he sort of went haywire.
Kurt grew up in what you have to describe as a pretty dysfunctional household. Of course, that description holds for a lot of homes in the world. But his parents divorced when he was a teenager, and that really greatly affected him.
A lot of kids that fall through the cracks if you don't play athletics, or your parents aren't rich or whatever, and you're kind of a latchkey kid hanging out in the streets. There's nowhere for you to go.
That was the category that Kurt fell into.
Yeah.
You know, he was a child of divorce. He was artistic but not athletic. You know, he was kind of an outsider in a lot of ways.
The kids seemed to pick on him. I mean, I guess they were jealous of him, probably from what he could do about his art and stuff.
In high school, they usually pick on anybody that's skinny and doesn't play football, and so Kurt had been one of those people.
Won't you believe that just my luck? 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 No recess, no recess.
On his musical end of it, we always thought he'd be a drummer because he'd always, every time he'd come over, he'd get a couple sticks, kindling sticks, and he'd beat on our pots and pans. He was always playing on them. And then his uncle, Chuck Friedenberg, had a band, or he was in a band. I don't know whether it was his or not. And Kurt used to go play the drums in that during rehearsal, I guess.
Well, I had a band, and his uncle was my drummer, and we used to practice at his house. And Kurt was staying there at the time. That's when his folks were breaking up, getting through the divorce deal. And so Chuck asked me if I would give Kurt guitar lessons if he paid for them. And I said, yeah. Did all that and got him going, and asked him what his goal would be to learn, and he told me Stairway to Heaven. I told him to put it on a cassette tape. This was back in 80 or 81, I can't remember exactly. And he brought it in, and I remember he had that on there, and School's Out for Summer, and I Like to Rock, and a few songs like that, and something by ELO. And so Stairway to Heaven, you don't learn it in the first month, you know, usually takes a little while. And he was just kind of getting into it about when he quit, and it seemed like it was about 3 months that he took lessons for.
I think he underrated himself as a musician. I think he was a lot better guitarist than sort of he wanted to admit. Yes, his stuff is pretty crude, and yes, most, you know, junior guitar players can play a lot of the same stuff Kurt did, but his knack to invent those sounds was really what was key. It wasn't the technical prowess of how he played the stuff, it was that he could create such interesting music.
One thing I worked on with him is he said he wanted to write songs. And so we kind of worked on that, and I showed him obvious chord progressions and ways to make things unobvious and do different things, right? And also like the value, at the time I was reading a book called Silence by John Cage, who said it's the silence in between the notes that gives them their power, right? And I told that to Kurt, and when I first heard Teen Spirit, there it is, you know, how he, and then down that real quiet, you know. So I thought, he remembered.
When Kurt used to come in, he was just so introverted. Everyone that I know that knows him or knew him from school was he hardly talked. So yeah, I think music is definitely for myself and a lot of people a release. So yeah, I can see where that would definitely be an outlet and something that you would get into.
Grandma, take me home. 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 Grandma, take me home.
A lot of his inspiration, good or bad, came from right around here in Aberdeen. And, you know, a lot of, you know, there's a lot of stories of, you know, things that supposedly happened to him or he did or didn't do. And a lot of it's exaggerated. But, you know, basically for those that, you know, hammer on Aberdeen now, they need to remember that angst and that attitude that he got was basically because of his upbringing here in Aberdeen.
early on, they were really very much more a punk band. By about '89, Cobain, though, was writing a few more melodic songs, and they sort of became more of a pop band.
The first time I really actually remember meeting him was when I got hired to photograph their first single cover for Sub Pop. And that single is called Love Buzz, or Big Cheese is on the other side. I believe it was like in September 1988. It was kind of a nice hot sunny day like this, the end of summer. And Chris and Kurt and Chad and Tracy came up in their old white van from Tacoma. Chris and his girlfriend Shelly lived in Tacoma then, and Tracy and Kurt lived in Olympia. And then they picked me up and we drove back to Tacoma to shoot pictures next to the Tacoma Narrows Bridge. Kurt, he was really young and sweet and didn't really do drugs. I think we smoked a little bit of pot and maybe drank a beer or something like that. It wasn't like anything serious. And both of the pictures are on the front and the back of the Love Buzz CD. I don't know, I guess what I think is conveyed in those pictures is Kurt is so nice and young and innocent, and he didn't really do drugs then, and it was just fun. We were all having fun. We didn't think much of it at the time.
This is a Christmas card he sent to Iris and I one year. He says, "Dear long-lost grandparents, I miss you very much," which is no excuse for not visiting. "I'm very busy living in Olympia when I'm not on tour with my band. We put out a single just recently and it is sold out already. We are recording for our debate LP this Monday, which will be released in March. In February, we are going to tour again to California. Then we'll be back in April, only to take a break, then on the road again. I'm happier than I ever have been. It would be nice to hear from you as well. Merry Christmas. Love, Kurt."
In January '89, Nirvana had a gig at the Hub Ballroom, which is at the University of Washington. And so they were getting ready to put out their first album. And so they had me come out and shoot some pictures live at that show. Tracy was also taking photos, and then Charles Peterson, our other friend, was taking photos. And so basically there was 3 photographers and practically no one in the audience. And so it was pretty funny. I think there's like a lot more photos than there are people in the audience then. I think it was mainly just their girlfriends and maybe 1 or 2 other friends that were there. It was almost practically empty.
You know, the grunge scene, although I think for most people it appeared that it just came out of nowhere, really was quite insular. And if you were living on the West Coast, and again in that corridor from Los Angeles up through Oregon and Portland and Aberdeen and Washington, through Seattle and up north to Bellingham in the northern part of Washington state, you really were aware all these bands, Nirvana, Tad, Mudhoney, they were around and they were gigging in the clubs. So I think sort of it really just grew out of it was a local music scene.
Well, grunge was what we in Seattle defined as the really loud garage rock that became popular in about 1986, probably through its heyday of 1989 in Seattle. And Nirvana really weren't one of those bands. You know, Nirvana were always more of a pop or rock band. There were some other bands that were much more grunge, if you want to call it that kind of predated Nirvana. Mudhoney, for example.
I met Nirvana and heard of Nirvana round about the same time, was when they came over to London in the late 80s to play with Mudhoney and Tad. And I think the received wisdom at that time was the band that were really important were Mudhoney, and then Tad were quite interested, and Nirvana were another band from Seattle who were on the bill. And Kurt Cobain and Krist Novoselic were there during the set, sort of wandering around, you know, sort of talking to people, but essentially looking very kind of lonely and lost. And I got introduced to Kurt and Krist and then drummer Chad Channing, and I would like to say that they blew me away when I finally saw them play live, but they were just one of the other bands that were playing that night, and I have to say I don't really come away with any great memories of them.
With Bleach, they were making some inroads. It was, now you look back and say seminal, groundbreaking, but really until they released Nevermind, until you had Smells Like Teen Spirit, that's when you really start to clock what Nirvana did.
Bleach is a very, very poppy album. I mean, despite the fact that it was a very heavy record, but it's, I mean, a lot of it reminded me of the Beatles, and a lot of Kurt's singing reminded me very much of John Lennon, particularly when he does the, you know, the real powerful scream on something like Twist and Shout. I could hear some of that in, you know, certainly in Floyd the Barber, that kind of straining for a note, that kind of intensity. And weirdly enough, it also struck me as very uplifting and positive and almost happy music.
The first album, Bleach, has a couple of songs on it that I think were really breakthroughs. One was About a Girl, a song that he said he wrote after listening to the Beatles all day. And you really get a sense with that song that Cobain was affected by the pop melody of the Beatles and some of the other, 60s invasion British groups.
About a Girl is a song that Kurt wrote about Tracy, and it's kind of really revealing in certain ways, because it's like, I can't see you every night, I've got to be free, you know, because Tracy was like the total loving woman that like totally took care of him and like was always there for him. She's like one of the sweetest people ever in the whole world, and she's got a really big heart, and she would do anything for her friends to help them. And I really believe that Kurt would have never gotten where he was if he hadn't hooked up with Tracy, because basically she worked for 2 years and let him sit there and write all those songs like on Nevermind and Bleach that he wrote when he was with her. I think maybe 90% of them he wrote while he was with her.
They weren't really a jam band with long solos, right? They were songs, little songs like Beatles had songs, right? Beginning, middle, and end, you know, it's a song. And they just had songs of the time, and Kurt was a good writer. He had interesting lyrics. He had a good voice.
In a way that Mudhoney was quite sneering and, you know, sort of put down a bit, actually very, very clever clogs. There was a kind of sincerity about Nirvana that I found really, really appealing. And if you told me then that they would become the byword for teen discontent and he would become the poster boy for youth suicide, you know, I don't think I would have believed it then.
We were Gen X, and there was a move away from sort of the plastic bands and the plastic music of the 1980s to a very introspective, very personal, very confessional approach to songwriting. So whether it was confessional for Kurt Cobain himself or confessional for the generation, I think is probably a matter of opinion.
He used a very sort of classic songwriting formula, whether consciously or unconsciously. I mean, I did ask him about this one time and he sort of denied it, but if you listen to Motown, they have these incredibly vibrant, joyous, you know, potent uptown, you know, sort of charged melodies, and these songs of utter desolation and loss and misery, you know. And I think there's a lot of that in Nirvana, particularly the early stuff. It's very kind of, you know, this and there, but a lot of the lyrics are actually very, very, you know, sad and, you know, kind of poor me stuff.
the lyrics just seem perfect, like I'm a negative creep, I'm a negative creep, I'm a negative creep, and I'm stoned or something. Like people would always tell you like, oh, if you'd only be more positive, you'd have a better time getting a job, or you could succeed if you only changed yourself into being something else. Like there was a lot of pressure like to be successful, and then like I think a lot of us like weren't, didn't think we were going to be really successful because we didn't fit the mold of the people that were successful. And so what was really great about Nirvana was they kind of changed the mold of what you could be and be successful. Like you could have blue hair and be successful now and stuff.
Cobain had an innate power to take these deep songs with very powerful and emotive lyrics and sort of put those juxtaposed with these poppy, loud songs, and the combination of that, of kind of both having this melody but also this edge to it, was really what made the band special.
If he was good and slick guitar player, then he might not have had that same sound. But he had that kind of raw sound, and he had a naivety about just really not knowing music theory and what went together, which is good, because if you know it, then you have to make all the right moves, and then you sound like everybody else. So if you don't know it, this is what I told them, just make it different.
After dinner, I had a scream.
They played a number of shows where there were 2 or 3 people, 20 people, then later 50 people, then later 200 people, and finally they broke through. And pretty much the middle of 1990, they became a pretty successful touring band.
All of a sudden, they were huge, and this was before Nevermind came out. Compared to like the shows like a year before where there was, like I say, maybe 20 people or less at the show, like this time the hall was big and it was completely packed. And then when Kurt came out, he said, save some pictures for the end, I'm gonna do something fun. And as it turned out, he smashed his guitar. That was like the first time he smashed his guitar and stuff. It wasn't actually his real guitar. Like he had a real one that he was playing, and then on the last couple songs he switched to like this other guitar that eventually like he kept on smashing it and gluing it back together for every show and stuff.
The musical climate, certainly in the United States, was really, really desperate for some big changes. You have a whole generation of young people coming up and growing up and wanting to have their John Lennon, wanting to have their Sex Pistols, wanting to have their Ramones, their moment, and really their anthem.
Smells Like Teen Spirit is the obvious song that really was their breakthrough and just an anthem for a generation. I always argue that you hear that song, and even if you can't speak English, you listen to the first 30 seconds of it and you go, my God, you're blown away by it, even before Kurt begins to sing.
It's a great pop record and it appealed across the board. It appealed to people that didn't like heavy rock. And usually when something appeals across the board, it's awful. In this case, it wasn't.
Sadly, I think in a way almost everything else they did, no matter how good, paled, because there was no song more perfect in every way, shape, and form than Smells Like Teen Spirit.
Kurt Cobain dated Toby Vale for a while, and he was also really close friends with Kathleen Hanna. And Kathleen and Toby started a band called Bikini Kill in a young feminist movement called Riot Girl. They were hanging out, and their whole room was covered in graffiti and stuff, like they were sticking things up on the wall and writing things on the wall. And Kathleen wrote "Kurt Smells Like Teen Spirit" on the wall, and then I guess that sort of evolved into that song. Well, apparently Teen Spirit is a kind of deodorant, but Kurt didn't know that.
You know, it just had that spark. There was that chorus, there was a sense of reaching out, there was a sense of anger, there was a sense of fun. Everything about it just all came together as one of those moments that so rarely happens, I think, for any artist or musician.
When Teen Spirit came out, I remember having a conversation with someone that worked for Nirvana's management, and they were saying, oh yeah, I mean, this could be really big. They could be as big as the Pixies. And I think that's the kind of level of thinking. Nobody quite saw how this was going to take off.
Suddenly they were like really popular and like on TV, and Saturday Night Live was great, like, because that was like the really big deal. Everybody loved Saturday Night Live, and I was so happy for them. I was so proud of them.
I really thought that was something to have a Cobain on TV that way and known around the world. I thought that was pretty good.
It was on Saturday Night Live is what they were on. So I'm watching the show, and there's Kurt, and I'm looking at him going, well, he sure looks familiar, you know. And then when they said his name at the end, I said, oh, that's Kurt? God, he's one of the last people I would have ever thought, because, you know, probably because he was just so quiet. That's probably why, you know.
Kurt was a very intense person. He was extremely driven. He knew exactly what he wanted, and he had like big plans on how to get there. And I think that a lot of people in our crowd were that way. Basically, we all thought we were going to take over the world and change the world, you know, and actually I was kind of surprised when it actually happened. Sort of like the people that had been kicked around in high school, like finally got a voice and became popular.
By the fall of '91, when the Nevermind came out in September of that year, they became an international sensation.
The first time I heard the album, I thought, this is stunning. I can't remember any other band at that time who was anywhere close to the same league that Nirvana was.
Now stop this off without any words. I got so high, I scratched till I bled. I love myself better than you. You know it's wrong, so what should I do? The finest day that I've ever had was when I learned to cry on command.
Nirvana were a band who just took a lot of elements that had been around for a long time, a lot of, you know, bits of Black Sabbath and Led Zeppelin and Bowie and God knows what else, Husker Du, Sonic Youth. I mean, it all merged into something else. They just did it better than everyone else. They just sort of made it their own. They just sort of had a kind of perfect sound that sort of gelled so well.
It definitely had to do with the way Kurt wrote his music and his lyrics and his sort of rather strange sense of melody.
When people hear Kurt's music, it's very emotional, but many people have different interpretations. You know, it can mean something very different to another person. You look at a song like Polly, which is a horror story written from the point of view of a rapist, and yet it's almost got a sympathetic view, and it's got a catchy sing-along chorus. These are some crazy contradictions that were really part of Kurt's great gift.
Let me crave dirty wings. Let me take a ride. Hurt yourself. Want some help? Help myself. Got some rope. Haven't told. Promise you. Haven't true. Let me take a ride. Hurt yourself. Want some help? Help myself.
I mean, the other thing is obviously they had the classic Pixies trick, which is quiet, loud, quiet, loud.
Just because you're paranoid, don't mean they're not at you. Gotta find a way, a better way when I'm mad. Gotta find a way, a better way
I don't like loud music, and I guess that's the reason I never liked his music at all. My wife, she sort of liked it. She thought it was nice. And that's where Kurt got most of his inspirations. That's where Kurt got his drawing from Iris.
Kurt just kind of let everybody be free. You know, the band was just kind of, okay, here's my part. What do you got, you know? And that's the kind of the way the band went.
They were a band who really enjoyed playing together, and, you know, whatever came out of each, you know, performance, you know, they were interested in how the different aspects, drums, bass, guitar, interacted.
I think Grohl was very important to the sound of Nevermind. He's a great drummer. He's one of rock's greatest drummers. I do think at times that Chad Channing gets sort of downplayed. Chad was a great drummer for the jazzier, punker side of Nirvana. Grohl was fantastic when it came to these powerhouse anthems. He could hit really, really hard.
On stage they were raucous and chaotic, and, you know, it was feedback, and even when they were playing, you know, stadiums, they were still, you know, they were still a punk band. They were still throwing guitars over the stage, you know. And when they, you know, when they played the songs from Nevermind, when I saw them before and after having heard the album, I mean, they were still, it was still just a bunch of guys making a noise, and it was still the sort of music you could have heard in, you know, a small garage club.
Novoselic's role many times is sort of underplayed. Not only was he a great bass player, but he arguably was sort of the gel that kept the band together. I mean, Kurt was a pretty fragile personality. Early in their career, many people thought Krist was the band's manager. I mean, he handled a lot of their affairs and really was the sort of spokesperson of the band during their life.
Both Dave and Kurt, in their own ways, were a bit wild, and, you know, would go off on, you know, doing silly pranks, but Krist would always be the guys who would say, "Come on, guys, we've got to do this." Or so. He seemed like the guy who held it together.
They weren't this incredible superstar mega machine. They were a band from a small city. So I think probably as things really rolled, you know, and you move out of music magazines and into tabloid television and tabloid journalism, probably is less equipped to deal with that kind of scrutiny. I don't think really that anybody in that band expected to find themselves under that lens.
Kurt at that time was starting to feel particularly discontented with his lot as a rock star. They were constantly ribbing the media, the mainstream media, to see how far they could go, to see how far they could push their status. Because Dave Grohl told me that this was a party they weren't really invited to. They'd crashed, and a lot of the expectations of what a band would have to do and put up with, you know, they just weren't prepared to go along with it.
Kurt was like too temperamental really to be suited from Stardom, because I think he was really, in some ways, a control freak. Like, he really wanted to have things his way. He could be like really bitchy too, you know, but I think almost anybody that's so driven creatively can be either really great or really bitchy. I'm lucky because I always had really positive experiences with him, and I was really good friends with his girlfriend. And, you know, they even kept in touch after he and Courtney had gotten married.
When I first met her, I thought she was pretty nice. But then when I was at the house in Seattle with Kurt, I didn't get to talk to her. I don't think I just said hi, that's about all. And then she went to town called a limousine and went to town.
Courtney Love probably, I think, was an influence on Kurt Cobain. They obviously had a very strong partnership. She had her band Hole, which I think so many people have discounted as sort of Kurt's little toy, but she has been a musician in her own right, punk rock princess, and she really is she's a show woman. She's got a wonderful persona.
Kurt was a real easygoing type person. I mean, he did his crazy stuff, but inside he was a mellow soul. Courtney Love is a raging, power-hungry, walk on anybody she can, right?
He gave up a lot of his friends to be with Courtney because Courtney was such a divisive personality that she kind of made him choose between his old self and the person that she wanted him to be.
Courtney was both at times a positive influence and at times a negative influence. One of their friends described them to me as two players in a play, and it's like they switched parts. You know, one day Kurt would be this role and the next day Courtney would. In general, I think Courtney is sort of overplayed as sort of a villain in Kurt's life. Most of Kurt's problems were self-created.
I don't believe he was as hard on drugs as they say, because every time I seen him, he was just as clean as you and I. And I think most of it was publicity.
People imagine that he lived an entire life of drug struggles, and really his struggles with heroin and drugs began in the greatest degree, you know, in the fall of 1991. He really only struggled with drugs for 2 or 3 years of his life. I mean, surprisingly, in the early days of Nirvana, Kurt was the straightest member of the band. He didn't drink, he didn't smoke. It was really just the last 2-3 years of his life where drugs really became almost a lens that you would see his work and his life through.
You know, obviously it didn't help anybody out, and I don't know with Kurt's stomach trouble may have even got him into drugs in the first place.
Kurt Cobain had a number of undiagnosed stomach problems, which could be ulcers, could have been diet, could have been irritable bowel syndrome. No one ever quite got a handle on it, but those chronic, you know, gastrointestinal issues also affected him, and I think added to his depression.
He hated eating. He would be, I mean, he'd be sitting at the table, and he'd be crying, tears running down his eyes, because he's, his stomach is so upset. Heroin helped him deal with the stomach pain. It would make these problems go away.
Kurt could have absolutely, if he was on dope, he absolutely couldn't have done a 2-hour show. He wouldn't have been able to hang on that long if he was on dope. And like when he'd come from a tour, he'd come right here, and they was no different than talking to you than him, you know. He was just that clean as far as I'm concerned.
I think as news became public of Cobain's struggles with heroin, I think that probably did affect the band. You know, how could it not?
No, what struck me about them was that they looked really tired, really, really tired. Kurt, he was more tired than most. I mean, he spent a lot of the time sleeping in the corner of the studio. But every now and then he'd sort of poke his head up and go, no, that's not right. And can you do something about that?
Drugs were not something that incapacitated him. He still was able to write songs and put on concerts.
In the period between Nevermind and then Utero, it's an open secret now that Kurt wrote most of Hole's Live Through This. So we can hear some of what was developing and some of what was coming through some of those songs, particularly songs like Doll Parts and things like that. That, you know, he was challenging a lot of things that he'd already built up. A lot of the machismo thing about being you know, a sort of rock and roll star. You would see him dressed up in a dress and things like that. But his lyrics then were developing this real sort of feminist slant, for want of a better term.
Kurt was always really political, and he hung out with a lot of young feminists, including myself, you know, because he always felt at one with the Riot Girls. And I think later they might have had a bit of a falling out because they accused him of selling out or something. But I think, you know, in effect, everyone came from the same place, and we all basically always considered ourselves punk.
Kurt at this time was threatening to make an absolutely uncompromising and unlistenable punk rock album. And he was quite capable of doing something weird and off the wall, but they still chose to make what is essentially a very good hard rock record.
To me, it sounded like they were trying to, you know, get away from Nevermind. It sounds more like Bleach in many ways. It's very raw. A lot of the stuff, if you listen to it, is probably performed live. I mean, Steve Albini is a great believer in people playing their music live.
Albini is a guy with a reputation for being an abrasive producer. I mean, he's always said he doesn't produce bands, he just records them. And I think that's what Kurt particularly wanted with that album. And I think there was an element of winding up fans, critics, and the record company.
Part of why he did that was because the American public wanted another hit like Nevermind, and so he said he was going to give them something that was really angst-ridden and hard to listen to that didn't have a beat. Because Kurt liked to torture people. He didn't want all the jocks and cheerleaders into his music. It really upset him when all the people that used to beat him up in high school got into his music and stuff. And so he wanted to make it obscure again.
I think In Utero is Nirvana's best album. I think it really was a record where they were able to, as a band, to kind of stretch out. There are some parts of that record that are hard to listen to, but that's the way Nirvana was live.
It's the album where they really broke away from that uplifting sound that they had on the first two records towards something that was a lot more abrasive and sad and angry and bitter, without any of the light. It was all shadow.
Heart-Shaped Box and All Apologies, they're introspective songs, and I think they're trying to get away from that, you know, kids mosh pit vibe.
The great strength of In Utero is that Cobain's songwriting grew. I mean, you listen to songs like Heart-Shaped Box and Pennyroyal Tea, both of whom Kurt had done quite a bit of work on those songs earlier, you know, around the Nevermind era. But those are just tremendous songs. They show a depth and a maturity that the songs on Nevermind don't display.
There are a lot of hints as to what the album is about, and one of the things that runs through it is a certain sort of feminist quality. He feels some kind of identification with women who were victims, you know, like Frances Farmer, and possibly perceived his wife Courtney to be a victim. You know, certainly she was not a popular person within the circle of the band, but also in the press. I mean, she was being perceived by the fans as the destroying woman who had intervened in this tight circle of male camaraderie.
When I first heard the song Rape Me, I think that was almost like a feminist anthem for him, you know, because he always felt at one with the Riot Girls.
The song is not about rape, it's not a glorification of rape, it's about Kurt Cobain, it's about, you know, how he perceived himself. And it's a very, perhaps a self-pitying song, but a very, very angry song, and a lot of the anger directed towards himself.
There were like people that were around him that were trying to like control him and stuff, and like I saw people like basically they were like the handlers around him, their attitude was, oh, what does the big baby want now? You know, and so they were kind of treating him like in this really weird thing, and I think it made him really uncomfortable.
He was under too much pressure, really. The other guys had a better deal because nobody was interested in them.
Utero didn't sell as well as Nevermind, and that was a disappointment to Kurt. Where they would have gone after that, who knows? You know, obviously there was a huge market still. They were one of the most popular bands in the world, but they weren't as big in '94 as they had been in the fall of '91. There was a shift even in those 2 years.
The band were about to split up, and although Courtney gets a lot of the blame for it, I think Kurt wanted to do other things. I mean, whether that was some of the directions that could have come from the Unplugged thing, or whether that was a really, really, really uncompromising punk rock record, who knows? I mean, we're never going to know that.
We was here at the house and the phone rang, and it was Wendy calling, stating that Kurt had committed suicide. And it really shocked my wife. Well, it did me too.
I was in my office at the Rocket, and a radio station called me before the news went out on the air, and they asked me if it could be true. And I you know, even though I knew of Kurt's problems, I still was in denial. I couldn't believe that it actually had happened.
Yeah, that was a surprise, but you know, but it's a sort of, you know, watching a plane crash kind of thing. You know, it's something bad is about to happen, but you don't know what.
On one hand, you could look at it and say it was inevitable. Given the history, given everything that had happened, certainly recently, you know, there was definitely cause for concern.
He was a depressed man. He'd already tried to kill himself in Rome, and there was another suicide attempt. He was breaking up with his wife. His band was falling to pieces. He was probably going to lose custody of his daughter, and he was being forced to quit heroin by various people, by his record company, and he didn't really want to.
Heroin kind of ruins lives and makes people completely hopeless, and I believe that he would still be here with us if he hadn't started getting into heroin. It seems like people that get into dope, very, very few people ever come out of it.
Success is what killed him. I think they made it just too quick, you know. They just went from a garage band to all of a sudden top of the college circuit, then #1 on Billboard charts.
I didn't think he was suicidal at all. And anybody else that was around him would say the same thing, that he was not suicidal. And he said it himself, that he wasn't suicidal.
Kurt committed suicide. He stuck a shotgun in his mouth and pulled the trigger. I don't really think that there's, as full stops to a life go, that's pretty much it. If there was a conspiracy to kill him that would involve the Seattle Police Department, and it would be so massive, and they would just have to be killing witnesses every week.
Most of the people, letters that I get, think he was murdered. The first thing is, how come that shotgun was still laying on his chest? To me, that if he had that 16 gauge in his mouth, and like it said, the shot was removed from it, the shell, it just seemed to me it would have, the concussion would have blown his eyeballs out or broke the front of his face up or something where it was fine. It just don't make sense. And then another thing is, why no fingerprints on any of the shells or on the gun? No fingerprints on anything, not even his. So somebody had to wipe that gun clean.
I spent 4 years writing my biography. I spent essentially 10 years writing about Nirvana. I've never seen any evidence that suggests his death was anything other than suicide. I mean, Kurt attempted to take his life a number of other times. The time he succeeded was just simply the final time, but there were a number of other overdoses, a number of other suicide attempts. No one who really knew Kurt well was surprised at his death.
They went in there and this captain, he says, oh, he was a damn doper. He committed suicide, that's it. And then the coroner and the whole works of them took that up, yeah, suicide, doper, He couldn't even have picked that shotgun up if with the amount of dope that he had in him.
I don't think he was murdered. Basically, he murdered himself, and I think that's really sad, but Kurt was an extremely willful person, and he wanted things his way. So in that sense, I believe it's true. A friend of a friend had been doing police ride-along and had been out to their house maybe a few weeks before for a domestic violence call. So we'd sort of heard through the grapevine that things weren't going very well.
Personally, I can't see him killing himself because he loved his music. Even though his life is, I think he was just getting ready to go to a divorce and his changing his will or something. I've heard a bunch of stuff like that. But anyway, one thing, musicians have is their music, which will carry you through anything.
I think a lot of his unhappiness was the fact that he could no longer felt that he could go on stage. He felt like a fraud. He felt he'd become everything that he despised. He'd become Bon Jovi.
Come as you are, as you were, as I want you to be, as a friend, as I know an enemy. Take your time, hurry up, the choice is yours, but don't be late.
There's a lot to learn from Kurt's story. In some ways, this is a cautionary tale. Be careful what you wish for. Kurt Cobain's dreams were turned into reality, and yet he found that he still struggled.
Actually, Tracy had a dream about him right after he died, and he came to her in the dream and said, "It's okay, I really want it, it's okay." And, that it's okay that he was going on and he was happy. So.
Once Kurt Cobain died, grunge disappeared from the city.
Kurt, as a cultural figure, has remained very important. And I think Nirvana as a band have remained tremendously important. Some of that is because they haven't been really knocked from the top. There hasn't been another great band.
I don't think they did change music. I think it all kind of snapped back quite nicely. I don't think there's any kind of lasting change that they sparked off. They were just a great band at the right time.
Cobain's death probably created a mythology and perhaps more of a legacy than they would have had had the band stayed together and recorded 10 albums.
He became a cultural icon as opposed to just a musician, because the whole essence of his life, both being pro-feminist and also being like the kind of kid that was kicked around in school, that became like a valid point of view.
As time goes by and more years pass between Kurt's death and in the present, people think less and less about the celebrity or the personality or the tragic circumstances of his death, and they remember more the power of those songs.
I've got some letters from women that were about Kurt's age and was following it along, you know, they were fans of Nirvana, and they got kids now, and their kids are write letters to me. None of the kids have ever mentioned the dope. It's always his music and his talent. That's all it is.